Welcome to the Constituting America Constitutional Chat.
Jay, thank you very much. And thanks to Aubrey and Kathy and everybody at Constituting America, and to the two gentlemen, Jorn and Jewel, who are going to ask the questions I'm going to probably dodge if I can. I'm going to get on with my presentation then, with your permission, Jay.
Yes, please go ahead. We're very excited.
Thank you. All right. I want to open with a quote from Jefferson: "Educate and inform the whole mass of the people. They're the only sure reliance for the preservation of our liberty." So these founders were concerned about civics, and everybody that's tuned in today is concerned about our country's future and our civics, and that's to be admired. We want to talk about why the Electoral College was designed by the founders. Very unique. Some people say it's undemocratic. They say it's even part of voter suppression. It ought to be abolished because sometimes candidates have more votes. Majority should always rule. So let's talk about our rich inheritance. In 1776, when we were fighting our revolution against the British, which took over 7 years, our founders studied history before and after the revolution and in founding this government. The world in 1776 was a difficult place, and always had been, full of tyranny, imperialism, ruthlessness, no social or economic mobility. If your family was in royalty, you were going to be the king or queen someday. If your father was a cobbler, you would be a cobbler. Slaves everywhere in every country, all throughout the Old Testament, all throughout history, and liberty virtually nowhere. What human history told our founders and tells us, that's why we should read history in part, is that human nature is broken. It always has been. It is a problem. Madison writes in Federalist 51, "If men were angels, we would not need this Constitution." This is the famous painting from 1787, actually, by Gov't, of the death of Socrates. And there's Plato with his arm on Socrates' knee, as Socrates is going to take the hemlock. Now, what happened here, and especially students should be reading Plato's Apology if they haven't read Plato's account of the trial, was the old man was put to death for asking questions and not worshiping all the right gods in Greece. It led Plato to write his book, The Republic. And in The Republic, he writes, "Tyranny naturally arises out of democracy." And his number one student was Aristotle. And Aristotle wrote a book called Politics, in which he said the only way to combat the problem of democratic tyranny or majority tyranny was a mixed regime, what we call today checks and balances. And indeed, there was a Roman Senate as well as a Caesar and citizens, and those were the three branches. It was very difficult to become a Roman citizen. But here's the symbol you can see today in Rome of that means the Senate and the people of Rome. That's what that logo stands for. But the Roman Republic, it looks like downtown DC, because our founders really wanted to have a successful republic, became an empire because the government fell apart. It fell apart because the Caesar took over, and our founders knew that in history, across history, kings, queens, tyrants, emperors across Asia and all the known world had unlimited power, and they knew to have freedom, you had to have limits on power so that people could be free. And so they wrote what has become the world's oldest constitution, our Constitution. And of course, in the Liberty Bell, they chose one quote from the Old Testament about liberty: "Proclaim liberty throughout all the land and unto all the inhabitants thereof." So these were liberty men and women. The number one book they read was and quoted from was the Bible, specifically Deuteronomy. But the second most quoted book among the founders was Montesquieu's book, The Spirit of the Laws. In other words, sort of a legal culture. The word law in Latin means to bind. And so a culture that people would have ordered liberty, not just license. And he, of course, came up with the with the more modern version, which we have, which is the checks and balances to divide power. Matter of fact, we divide it in the Congress, the House and the Senate. So we double divide power in the legislative branch because that was seen as a dangerous branch. So the founders decided not to have a democracy, but to have Republican government, which looks like that. In questions of power, then, Jefferson wrote, let no more be heard of confidence in man, but bind him down from mischief by the chains of the Constitution. So just like we have rules in a sports game, or families have certain rules like, be home by midnight or whatever the rules might be, everybody needs rules to have an ordered society. Now, the number one problem in the Constitutional Convention was you had 9 small states and 4 large states. Virginia had 10 times the population of Georgia, Delaware smaller than that. Rhode Island didn't even attend the Constitutional Convention because they thought James Madison and the Virginians, and Virginia included West Virginia at the time, were going to take over things. The state of Maine was part of Massachusetts. So we had Maine, New York, Pennsylvania, Virginia. These were and Boston, of course, the big states. We had the Virginia plan, which failed. That was Madison's plan. New Jersey plan by William and Patterson. That also failed. And then the Great Compromise, which was Madison and Roger Sherman from Connecticut coming up with the thing that made the Constitution possible, which is the House will represent population size, but the Senate, every state gets 2 votes, no matter their size. And that was the key to having this Constitution. This was the large, small state. And so there we have it, the state power versus the population power balance. They took votes then, the last week of the Constitutional Convention, they decided on the Electoral College. They had a vote earlier that year, that summer. Should we have a popular election of the president? No, the big cities and the states would always rule. Election by Congress? No, the president would not be independent of the Congress. He would just be whatever they wanted him to be, whatever they wanted him to do. Election by the states? Yes. To understand America, you have to understand the founders thought majority rule becomes majority tyranny because man is broken. And they did not want to have a national popular vote. They wanted to have the states rule this country state by state. And they wanted to have a president had a will of his own, as the Federalist Papers talk about. And the Electoral College, therefore, is this balance of populations in each state vote, but then we aggregate those votes into the states, the electoral votes, and then we aggregate that nationally. So we actually, people say, we're not a democracy. We actually have 50 Democratic votes for president, and then those are aggregated. So we're much more democratic than most republics. Let's look at the European Union. European Union has 27 heads of government. And these are republics, if you will. They're democratic republics. I like to ask how many are elected on this stage by national popular vote? 2, Cyprus, a little island, and France. That's it. All the rest use a 2-step method of election through parliament. Why is that? Well, the French Revolution really gave a bad name to mob rule, majority rule, et cetera, because it quickly led, after 10 years, to Napoleon, which led to the kings again, Napoleon II, et cetera. The French are on their 5th constitution, and since 1789. We're on our 1st constitution since 1789. Theirs is 67 years old. Ours is 233 years old. There was a second French Revolution in 1848. Matter of fact, in 1848, because of a potato famine across Europe, 30 countries had revolutions against kings and queens and other forms of government. And this was really the beginning of democratic or republican rule across Europe. This is the Electoral College of Great Britain. If people don't like our Electoral College, we'll just have the US Congress elect our president, because Mr. Churchill was never on the ballot of all Englishmen, nor Mrs. Thatcher, nor Boris Johnson, who just survived a no confidence vote yesterday. This is the Electoral College of Germany. Mrs. Merkel, for the last 12 years, was chancellor, only elected by her constituency, just like just like Winston Churchill, never buy all of Germany. And on. Spain Electoral College, not going to show you 27 of these or 25, but this is the Electoral College up in Ottawa, Canada. This is the current prime minister. In 2021, he was reelected as prime minister. There are 6 parties in Canada. His party got 33% of the vote only, but it got the most seats, and therefore, with 33% of the vote, this man is the head of government in Canada. The Conservatives got 200,000 more votes than he got, but they didn't get as many seats as his party. These countries are where heads of government are elected by parliament, not popular vote. Canada, New Zealand, Australia, Japan, Norway, India, Morocco, Singapore. So majority rule is not how most republics elect their president or their prime minister or their chancellor, because they fear the mob rule, if you will. They want to have a filter. Now, these are countries where the head of government is elected by popular vote. Iran. And by the way, you might want to vacation in some of these places. Iran, Nicaragua, Venezuela, Russia, Afghanistan, Mexico, Turkey, Zimbabwe. In 2012, John Boehner was elected Speaker of the US House of Representatives. Mrs. Pelosi was the minority leader at the time. He had the most congressmen, representatives, 234. She had 201. But her members, 200, they got 49% of the popular vote cast for House members, and Boehner's people only got 48%. So we have actually had in our history 12 speakers whose opposition party had more popular votes, but fewer seats. Another way to look at it is this way. In the World Series in 1960, I'm just picking on the Pirates and the Yankees here, 4-3, the Pirates won that World Series. As it happens, in that World Series, the Pirates over 7 games scored 27 runs, the Yankees 55 runs. So it is it the most votes or runs, or is it the most games or seats in Congress or electoral votes? In other words, the world is complicated, and we use a system much more like the World Series than we might want to think. But there are those on the left that want to have a national popular vote, and 15 state legislatures have passed that. This is the United States by population. You can't find most states on this map. 9 of our states have 50% of our people. Los Angeles County has 41%, has more people than 41 of our states. Los Angeles County, more people than 41 of our states. This is a different planet. We call this Montana. They have 2 House seats and 2 Senate seats. Just got a new House seat, actually. This is Manhattan. I like to ask people how many acres in Manhattan, but the answer is right here, 843. How many of those acres are farmed? And of course, everyone laughs. It's none of those are farmed. The US Agricultural Department says that it takes about 5 acres to feed one person for a year, 5 acres. If Central Park was farmed, we would feed 168 people from Central Park. Who feeds the other 9 million New Yorkers every day? These people do. And that's where our presidential primaries start, with the Iowa caucus. That's for a reason, because we want our presidential candidates to realize it's just not about big cities. We're a big country, and people that don't have a lot of population have a lot of land to feed that population. And we're stronger because of that. And our second presidential primary is in New Hampshire, another small state with small farms and small shops, so that every presidential candidate can meet about 3 times every person that lives in that state. And those are the first 2 tests to become president: the people that feed the nation and the people that represent the nation in miniature, and frankly, one of the original states. So we have 50 state elections. They're all democratic, if you will, and then we aggregate those, and that's our Electoral College. We've gone from 13 states, of course, when these 39 of the 55 delegates, not all signed the Constitution. Some didn't sign because we had no Bill of Rights, which is why first thing that James Madison did in Congress was to get the Bill of Rights done. And now we have 50 states, and people can vote with their feet. We just had 7 congressional seats move after the last census. So if people are unhappy in America, they go to other states where there's more job opportunity or a different culture, different education choices, on and on and on. And so it's a very rich federalism that we've inherited here. And all because of the world's oldest constitution, which has been amended 27 times. And part of that is the Electoral College, which is why we probably have a 2-party system. Every European country pretty much has 9 or more political parties, 6 in Canada. We have 2 major parties because of that. And then finally, Lincoln, don't interfere with anything in the Constitution. That must be maintained, for it is the only safeguard of our liberties. And with that, I will close and entertain questions. Thank you for your attention.
Michael, that was really excellent. Thank you very much. Very interesting historical take, as well as comparison to other governments around the world. So I really appreciate that. We're going to go to questions. Before we go to the audience questions, though, I would like to turn it over to Jewel and Jorn for your comments and questions.
All right. It was an awesome presentation. Thank you for the slideshow. It was the first time we had something quite like that on Constitutional Chat, so appreciated it. I also enjoyed the different graphs and maps and all the stuff to make it visually easier to understand. As far as the, when we were comparing to the European governments and how many of their chancellors or prime ministers are elected, what is the, they do have a 2-step process, you said. Most of them are not popular vote. What are major differences between our electoral college and any of those comparisons? Is there anything that makes our electoral college definitively better or more American than any of those?
Well, first of all, we have over 300 million people. The largest country in Europe has 80 million. So to rule a continental republic as we are, with a Republican small r features in our constitutional system, the more you can give voice to the different rich and unique parts of a big nation like this, the more you can actually have a chance to keep a nation together. We know that, for example, in Belgium, there are really 2 nations in a way. There's the Walloons in the south and the Flemish in the north, which is Dutch speaking and French speaking. And so they're sort of constantly semi-divided as a country. The British have a different system where they have the Scottish, the Welsh, the Northern Irish, and the English. And Scotland and Wales have their own legislative bodies now. And I think the Northern Ireland does as well. And so they sort of disaggregate. I think one of our real strengths is in the 2-party system. The average European parliamentary democracies have about 9 parties. And so usually they don't last very long. We have 4 solid years of one president. Last year, the Israelis elected a prime minister. It took them 9 months to elect because they have 10 parties among 110 members of parliament. And that person is now going to have to reconstitute his government because their coalition has fallen apart. So that's a long answer, but we have stability in a 2-party system because of the Electoral College, because of the design of the winner take all in the states.
Were there any voices calling for a popular vote, number one, during the time of the founding of the nation? And I know there were some that were not so in favor of people, of average people getting a vote. So are those opposite ends of a political spectrum at the time of the founding? Was that a debate going on, or was it more so just between those trying to come up with an electoral college type of way for the citizen to have a vote versus people who didn't necessarily think the citizen should have a vote?
All right, good question. So there were about 6 votes on the floor of the Constitutional Convention about how to elect a president. The first vote was along the lines of the Virginia plan, which is the Congress. But then they started to debate, is it the House or the Senate or both? And they couldn't quite agree on that. They then took a vote, should we have a national popular vote for president? Only one delegate from one state, the state of Pennsylvania, voted for that. All the other delegates voted against it. So that was never given a chance. Nobody was going to have that. So it really was, then they voted again to have a parliamentary system. Then they put that on the back burner while they did the Connecticut Compromise and many other things, of course, in the Constitution. They could not decide how to elect a president. So they had a committee of 11, it was called. The Committee of 11, or the Style Committee, included Gouverneur Morris, James Wilson, who wrote the preamble, by the way, Madison, and well, trying to think, I think those are the main 3 that came up with the Electoral College: Madison and Gouverneur Morris and James Wilson. And they brought it to the floor the last week, and they said, look, every legislature will decide whether or not there'll be a vote. In the early days of the Republic, state legislatures, until 1928, some state legislatures cast the electoral votes, not the people didn't vote. It was a legislative vote, like they elected state U.S. senators. So anyway,
Great. Yeah. And I think that's so interesting that today, an average American may have a hard time understanding that there was not a direct vote at the beginning to vote for president. It did go through the legislator, and that was in no way as seeing like that we were less free or had less of a direct influence on the direction of the country. And I do think that's interesting, and that brings me to the next comment. There's a difference between national and federal, and I'm wondering if the Electoral College interfaces with that idea, if you've thought about that idea that the Electoral College is part of what makes it a federal government and not necessarily a national government, but we've lost that identity of states and the federal system. Could you speak about that in the Electoral College and why that system works?
Right, it's a good question. And maybe, I think the best way to understand it is, I like to call the US Senate the Assembly of States for several reasons. If you think about our system, when a president nominates a Supreme Court justice or a federal judge, who confirms? The states. Everybody gets 2 votes. So Rhode Island, California get 2 votes on that. When the president appoints a cabinet, who confirms? The states. 2 votes, no matter how large or small. When we have a treaty with a foreign government, who accepts that treaty? Advise and consent, they call it, right? The Senate, the states. When we have an impeachment of a judge or a president, we've had 2 with Mr. Trump, the House impeaches, whether it's the Supreme Court justice or a cabinet official or a president, but who is the trial jury of an impeachment? The states, et cetera. And if you want to amend the Constitution, it takes 38 states to do it. And if no one wins the Electoral College vote, and this happened in 1824 with Jackson, Andrew Jackson versus Clay versus John Quincy Adams, it's thrown into the House of Representatives, but the House of Representatives votes by state delegations. So when we decide a presidential election, when nobody wins the Electoral College, because let's say there's 4 parties, the states vote by every state delegation in the House gets one vote. My point is, there's a huge amount of state power built into this where you wouldn't find in Mexico or in France or in other unitary systems. And it allows for the distribution and control of power. So as I said at the beginning, the founders feared tyranny, majority tyranny, or tyranny of the most populous. And so everything they did was to curb tyranny and divide power, what we call, I used to be at the Intel Corporation, distributing computing, not mainframe. So, a national government would be a mainframe, distributed computing would be everybody's got their own device, their PC or their phone, etc.
And there's a concept in republicanism. It was a worry at the time that we were too big to be a nation, let's say. And that was solved through the federal idea where we would have many small republics. And then the Constitution was a way of making sure that those, basically we could get the freedom and the correct representation of living in a small republic, but the resources from all those small republics. And that's a real strength of our democratic republic, a real strength of the American founding, and resulted in incredible prosperity and liberty, but is really not discussed or taught that that's really the way we are, and or made to understand that at the time of the founding, they didn't want someone in Virginia, really didn't want someone in New York deciding how they were going to live day to day.
Right.
But there's a great push for popular representation, as if that whoever the whole country wants, that's who should lead us, and not necessarily the same tension between area, or not the same tension understood by Americans between areas like that. Maybe what California wants is really not what Pennsylvania wants.
Yeah, right. Well, the price of being in a group is that you don't always get your way, whether you're a family or a church group or whatever. The strength of this nation is that we've distributed power in a certain way, and that that you can have local differences. The state of Delaware, for example, has no early voting, but here in Virginia, where I live, we have weeks and weeks of early voting. 17 states have legalized marijuana. The other haven't. About 25 states have educational voucher system where you can use your tax dollars to choose schools, and the others don't. So we have lots and lots of flexibility. During COVID, my gosh, the governor of New York had a very different approach than the governor of Florida. Governor of Florida didn't close schools, businesses, synagogues, churches, etc. The governor of New York and California did. Well, and there's been a lot of discussion and debate and studies now on which of those work better, but it's what we call the laboratory of states. And it's wonderful that we have those kind of differences to see what works best. And I showed after the census, we've had millions of Americans change states because they decide, I like living here better than there for whatever reason. We have 6 states that don't have income taxes, and those states are Texas and Florida and Nevada, for example, don't have income taxes, and they have nothing but an influx of people fleeing income taxes, 9% in California, for example. So it really is, federalism is a real strength, especially the bigger the country is.
Yes, and Jordan, you got some questions now before, because I'll just keep going.
I'm just curious, first off, through history, since the Electoral College was made, I know we've heard about it recently, get rid of it, yada, yada, yada. But were there any real significant pushes before now?
Yeah. Yes, great question. Twice, 1970 and 1977. In the US, in 1970, there was an effort in the US Senate to put to the states a constitutional amendment and it had passed the House, and it was on the floor of the Senate. And Eugene McCarthy, who actually, as you know, ran for president, Senator McCarthy, a Democrat, led the charge to defend the Electoral College, and he won over his fellow senators. In 1977, there was another effort, and Jimmy Carter, who was president, endorsed, and by the way, in 70, Nixon as president endorsed getting rid of the Electoral College, President Nixon, a Republican. And only Gene McCarthy and his colleagues stopped it in the Senate, the states, right? The states. The states stopped it, not the House, the popular vote, the states. In the state assembly, what I call the Senate. In 1977, Jimmy Carter brought this up, and it was moving, it went through the House, and Daniel Patrick Moynihan, a great senator from New York, another Democrat, led the charge. His floor speech, which is about 1 hour in length, is a magnificent discussion of why we need to have the Electoral College. And he, just like Eugene McCarthy, put an end to that effort. And of course, the states, 2 votes each, didn't like the idea as well. So the Senate has saved the Electoral College twice just in the 20th century. That was the only time there was really a run against it of any import at all. In 1824, there were 4 candidates for president. Nobody got the Electoral College votes needed. Andrew Jackson got the most votes, but he split it with 3 other people. He certainly didn't have 51%. He probably had 35%. Have to look it up. But second was John Quincy Adams, and then third, I think, was Bell, but I have to look it up as well. But it went to the House of Representatives, and Henry Clay was the 4th candidate. He threw in with John Quincy Adams, and the 2 together defeated Andrew Jackson in the US House. And so he ran 4 years later and actually got elected. He beat John Quincy Adams and had 2 terms, but that made Jackson a lifelong opponent of the Electoral College. There were 3 other elections that were controversial. Bush v. Gore in 2000 and Trump versus Clinton, where both Gore and Mrs. Trump got more popular votes than George W. Bush and Trump. But Trump won 30 states and Bush won 30 states versus 20 for the others. And they campaigned based on the rules. You know, Trump never went to California because he didn't think he was ever going to win there. Mrs. Clinton went there a lot to raise money, I think, and she didn't go to Wisconsin and Michigan. And that's where she lost the election, by not going to the toss-up states.
So I kind of thought about this a lot, and you really just sparked it with talking about the Quincy Adams election. Do you think that the presence of that 3rd candidate can be a detriment or a help? But also, why do you think that 3rd candidate hasn't grown?
What hasn't grown?
Why do you think that having a real 3rd party hasn't blossomed?
Oh, that's a great question. And it's exactly because of the Electoral College. Eugene Debs, who was a socialist in the progressive era, early 1900s, ran 3 times for president. He's quite a character. Actually was thrown in jail at one point for his activism, which made him a martyr, which is fine. He got, in one of those presidential elections, 20% of the vote and did not get 1 Electoral College vote. Ross Perot in 1992 ran against George Herbert Walker Bush and Bill Clinton. And Perot got 20% of the vote, didn't get 1 electoral vote, but because he was a conservative, he took so many votes away from Bush that Bill Clinton was elected. So Ross Perot, a conservative Republican that didn't think George Herbert Walker Bush was conservative enough, he got Bill Clinton elected because of that action. So these 3rd party, if you look at the vote in Florida in 2000, George W. Bush won by, I think, 756 votes, something like that, 700 some votes. But Ralph Nader was an independent candidate in Florida and got several thousand votes, and they would have gone to Al Gore if Nader wasn't on the ballot. And therefore, Ralph Nader actually determined that George W. Bush would be elected because of the Florida electors, you know? So third parties have a role, but it's a spoiler role, right? It's not anything but that. The only reason we don't have 12 political parties in America is because of the Electoral College. And because the way the Europeans do it, if you get yourself elected to parliament and there's 8 parties, then 2 or 3 of those parties have to have a coalition to form a governing coalition to elect a prime minister, right? And so you have a proliferation of parties because, you know, conservative party, a liberal party, a labor party, on, et cetera. And it disaggregates politics and makes it harder and harder to govern. So 30 years ago, the average European prime minister had twice the months or years in office as they do today, because the parties have gone from about 5 or 6 to about 9 or 10 per country. The Spanish have 10 parties, the British have 10 parties, et cetera. And this disaggregation means that it's hard to hold a coalition together. And with 300 million people, the fact that in November, we will know who the new speaker is going to be. If the Republicans take over, it's probably going to be Kevin McCarthy. If not, if the Democrats hold the House, it's going to be Nancy Pelosi. We know that after the election. But in most republics, as soon as the House would meet, they then would have to have coalitions. It might take 2 months to get a Speaker of the House who might last 3 months or something. So if you want to have stability in a huge republic, have a 2-party system, which is have an electoral college.
If I had to make one negative observation of the Electoral College, it wouldn't really be with the Electoral College itself, but it would more so be that the Electoral College grew out of the concept of federalism and a union of states, but states' rights have been really trampled on by the federal government in a lot of ways, going back to things like the Commerce Clause and eminent domain and these different ways that the Supreme Court kind of stopped. We've talked about it before, but in the early 1900s, we saw presidents and the federal government able to accomplish certain things that the Supreme Court previously would strike down. So in light of the states having less of a strong governance independent of the federal government, is that make the way the Electoral College is supposed to work flawed in a way?
So it's a great question. We could really talk for a couple hours about this, because what you really raise is we had a civil war because the founders couldn't figure out what to do about slavery. They thought it would whittle away. But 5 years after the Constitution was written, Cyrus McCormick invented the cotton gin. And the cotton gin, by a factor of 30 or 40, increased the productivity of slaves to produce cotton, what they call king cotton. And it became the world's manufacturing source for cotton, for the textile mills all over Europe and in the United States. And therefore, slavery wasn't going to go away. Part of getting rid of slavery was not only the 13th Amendment of getting rid of slavery, but the 14th Amendment, which had the equal protection and the due process clauses. And then courts started using those to change laws in the states. So the irony of the Civil War, which was for states' rights, meant that amending the Constitution allowed the beginning of the erosion of state rights through the court system, through litigation. And we do have sort of a new Constitution because of the 14th Amendment. The Commerce Clause was fine. That was a single market thing. But to go in and get rid of Jim Crow and all the other shenanigans that went on, especially in the South, the courts were used.
Question, as far as I know, the Declaration of Independence is not actually a law, but in the Bill of Rights, if you had, I guess my question is that it clearly all men weren't created equal if you could have some slaves. So why did the 14th Amendment need to rely on the ability of the federal government to change up laws like Jim Crow when that seems to already violate the spirit of the law or the spirit of our founding documents?
Well, originally the 14th Amendment was to apply only to government action in states, not private action. But it was, I don't really know how else to answer that. It evolved into private action as well.
Yeah, it makes sense. It makes sense.
But it really was to regulate some of the actions of the states.
Mhm.
Coming out of Reconstruction, et cetera. Of course, Reconstruction actually ended because of the Electoral College debate of 1876. This is the Hayes-Tilden election, which maybe somebody has a question about that.
Do we have any questions before that you were trying to get in, not from the audience? I'm not sure if should we go to 250 or do we have?
Well, I've got Joan and Jewel. I have a question from Tova, if that's all right. I'll go ahead and ask that now. She had a couple of questions that I think, Michael, you already addressed, but one of them, maybe you can revisit it in a little more specificity, was the power of the minority in a republic versus a democracy. And in our system, how much, there's some critique that minority might have too much power in a republic. And she mentioned, for instance, issues that cover the entire nation, like the environment, or gun control, or things that, as she says, politicians are voting for things that the majority of Americans do not support. Do you see a problem in republic of tending towards giving undue power to the minority?
So in the court system, we want to have minority rights defended. Matter of fact, if we'll remember that in a jury trial on a criminal case, people might go away for prison. There's 12 jurors. You have to have all 12 jurors agree on something. It's not just 9 or 7 out of 12. It's not majority rule. It's unanimous on either they committed the crime or they didn't. On acts of elected officials, one of the great things the founders did, if you think about it, is every 2 years the House is up, US House. Every 6 years, the Senate is up, but actually they have 6-year terms, but every 2 years, 1/3 of the Senate is up. And every 4 years, the president is up. So every 2 years, we have a readjustment of our government. Now, if anybody in the audience is a sailor, sail boats, you know that if you want to go from A to B, you don't just sail in a straight line, because the wind's not going to have you do that. You actually tack back and forth to get there. And so every 2 years when we have an election, our republic is tacking back and forth to try to adjust, right? And so, for example, Mr. Biden comes in and everything's going to be wonderful now because, because of his campaign approach, et cetera. And now all of a sudden, gasoline prices double. We have inflation. We have concerns at the border. We have an exit from Afghanistan. People are, 75% of Americans say they're not very happy with what's happening in our country. Well, guess what? In a few months, in November, we get to change maybe the House of Representatives leadership and maybe the Senate as well. So yes, I guess what I'd say to Tova is every majority is a temporary majority in the American Republic because we can change it. The problem is when you have a permanent majority and the minority never gets to say, this is how you destroy self-government, because people feel like there is no ability to correct course or to have a change, right? And that's why politicians pay attention. I promise you, everybody running for the House and Senate right now is talking about, well, if I'm elected or reelected, we're going to make some changes. That's always, the number one word in the English language in America is NEW, new. I'm gonna do something different. I'm gonna change something. So it's a good question. The
Great.
question I like to have asked, which hasn't been asked today, is what do you think about Maine and Nebraska? Because they disaggregate their presidential electors, don't they? They're the only two states that do, but that's constitutional because the Constitution says the state legislature will decide how the electors are chosen and in what manner. And because Maine was largely seen as Republican and then a Democratic state, Nebraska has been largely seen by candidates in a Republican state. By disaggregating their electors, they're trying to get candidates from both Republican and Democratic Party to visit those states because they'll at least get 1 or 2 electors out of the 5 or whatever the number is, right? All of our states could do that. And if all of our states had done that in 2012, Mitt Romney would have defeated Barack Obama if we had disaggregated the Electoral College votes by congressional district. So there are changes, and that would be a constitutional change that we could make. Most states don't want to do it because they like winner take all. You have to come and get all of our people. We're not going to disaggregate ours. But if you think about it, if California did that, Republican candidates would go to California to get those Republican House districts elected, to get those electors. So for some of the big populous states like New York and California, my opponents on the left for national popular vote say, well, gee, there's a lot of Republicans in New York and California who think they're never going to have their say in presidential elections. I say to them, get the legislatures to disaggregate their electoral votes among the congressional districts, and you'll see Republican candidates visit those states like crazy. So we have a lot of flexibility in this federal system.
So that's a great point, and it brings to a question from the audience that John Chambers asked. Thank you, John. He was looking back in history on fiddling, if you will, with the Electoral College. So I don't know the case, but Jackson had Van Buren go state to state, perhaps trying to get each to pass a law to have the party with the popular vote pick the electors for the state. And that was one way he was able to, I don't know if you want to call it rigged, but get the Electoral College to swing in his way. And then today, I think, and this is not John's question, but there's movement to have a state would accept the popular vote of the national level, and they would pick their electoral electors that way. So I don't know if that's rigging either, but could you address those two?
Yeah, well, the first one, I think we largely do now. The way we, for example, I was a presidential elector here in 2020 in Virginia, was elected by my party in a party caucus of 226 people. And they appointed me for my congressional district to be a presidential elector. In virtually every state now, each party chooses their electors, but only whoever wins, the electors from the victorious party in that state goes to the state capitol, right? So we have, in Virginia, we have a Green Party presidential electors, we have a Libertarian presidential electors, we have a Constitution Party presidential electors, et cetera, but only the Democrat or Republican is probably going to go to Richmond to cast their votes. Well, all of our states have that system, and I think that's what Jackson and Van Buren were talking about, rather than having, let's say, state legislatures make this decision. But I don't know the exact case that the gentleman is talking about. On the national popular vote, what happened there was there's a guy named John Koza in California, who's a very wealthy guy. He has the patent on the scratch-off lottery ticket technology. So he's a very, very wealthy guy. He's an engineer, and he didn't like it that Gore didn't get elected president because he had more popular votes. So he hired some two political scientists to come up with the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact, which has been passed by 15 all-Democrat legislatures, governors, that says no matter how the voters of our state vote, whomever wins the national popular vote, our state government will tell our presidential electors to vote for that person, even if the majority of our own state voters voted for somebody else, which is quite an affront or even an insult to the voters of their own state, I think. But 15 legislatures have passed this, and they have 195 electoral votes in their compact. They need 270 to have the compact go into effect. It would be very dangerous. We'd have a constitutional crisis. the Supreme Court would probably have to decide whether or not this compact among states would be lawful. It probably is not. And in the Constitution, we do have the compact clause, and they have not gone to the Congress to get the permission to have a state compact. But because, of course, the US Senate, the Assembly of States, would never be for the National Popular Vote Compact in any numbers.
So another question from the audience that is very interesting. You mentioned states and the powers of states. And we've also, of course, being Constituting America, we've talked about the constitutional process, amending the Constitution, whatnot. So the states run the elections, is that not correct? And if so, what if such a change to the Electoral College would be implemented, what would be the impact on the state's power to just run the elections?
Well, the National Popular Vote Compact?
Yes, I'm sorry, yes.
Yeah, it's a very good question. I think there would be litigation brought on equal protection of the laws, 14th Amendment, because they would say, for example, some states before COVID, we had 6 states that had all mail-in ballots, like Oregon. That's all, the only way people voted was mail-in. And other states that only had mail-in for absentee, if you're going to be out of town or something, or you're in a hospital or a retirement home and you couldn't get to the polls. We have some states that have early voting. We have some states that don't have early voting, et cetera. So there is no uniformity in our election law. And so if we had a National Popular Vote Compact that went into effect, people in the states affected could bring federal litigation and say, we've had a popular vote, and yet the millions of voters that participated had different rules. This was the whole idea about HR 1, which was House Resolution 1 that Mrs. Pelosi and the Democrats tried to pass when Biden became president. It was their number one priority. House Resolution 1 was to nationalize all elections and have the federal government come up with all the elections, to save our democracy. That's what they want to talk about. And because they knew with that, they could have the National Popular Vote have uniformity of elections. So if the National Popular Vote happened, we have such disuniformity of voting that it would be stunning how anything could be seen as constitutional. But that's, when you don't amend the Constitution, but rather you try to have an end run around it, you have real constitutional problems. And that's one of the reasons why they talk about packing the court. I mean, all these things are a piece, which is, let's have federal takeover elections. Let's unify it. Let's have people under 18 vote. We have New York City and San Francisco allow people under 18-year-olds to vote for city elections now. So you either have rules for a republic and federalism, or you have litigation, a lot of chaos, and you can lose your self-government.
Very good, thank you. We just have a few minutes left. Just a quick question. This comes from me, so I just want to ask, because we do have a few more audience questions. I'm sorry we can't get to them all, but we were talking about international governments. Is there a similar move to a national or federal popular vote in other countries in Europe, or that has any strength that you're aware of?
No, honestly, I'm not an expert in that. I spent a lot of my career in Europe, as you know, as president of the European American Business Council. I'm not aware of any republic in Europe having a debate about let's have a national popular vote. I'm just not aware of it. The parliamentary system, matter of fact, all the incentives, because they have so many parties, all the incentives are to keep it a parliamentary system so they can jockey for position to be part of a government without being a large major party. So I think most politicians in Europe would be against that, because it would, if you have a national popular vote, it would get down to a runoff like they do in France with just 2 major parties, and 8 parties don't want to become 2 parties because then they lose their individuality.
Excellent. Well, I think we're down to about a minute to go in our time. Michael, I want to say thank you from Constituting America and everybody who participated today. I thought this was a really very interesting presentation. Some excellent data. I love the way you trace the history of that. It puts things in really great context and allows us to understand the issues that are facing us, but it's also very relevant and happening today and on the news as we speak. So thank you for that. And also your answers to the questions, which I think were straightforward and precise. And I'm sure that the other panelists would agree that they had a good discussion with you. So thank you. We always ask everybody to support Constituting America and come and be on our constitutional chats. Look at our 90-day studies and all the other great information that the organization provides. Anyone else on the panel would like to make some final comments?
Yep. Thank you very much, Mr. Maibach. It was a great show.
Yeah, I appreciate it. Nice talking to you.
My pleasure, gentlemen. Aubrey, thank you very much. And Jay, really appreciate you chairing this today. It's an honor to be here. And I think everybody ought to consider supporting Constituting America and sign up for their emails.
Excellent.
And as you mentioned, I travel around the country for free to give speeches to civic groups and schools. If I can do that, just let me know through our website.
Excellent. SaveOurStates.com or org? .com. Okay, great. Well, Michael, thank you so much. We really appreciate you being on, and we appreciate everybody who supports Constituting America for being on as well. Thank you very much. Aubrey, I'll turn it back over to you.
Yeah, thank you all, and we hope to see you next week.